hear from you. I hear from you a blind attack on Jews and Israel that goes on day after day and year after year. I resent it and I condemn it.
Excuse me, Mr. Charney, I never mentioned the word Jew.
Actually, Israel would be happy if everybody in the Middle East disappeared except them. Actually, Israelis are such racist supremacists. They would be happy if the whole world disappeared except for them. Or to use the rest of the world as slaves, because they're Ubermenschen. They're so superior. They're so much more important. And everyone believes it. Everybody falls for it. The Ubermensch, the Supermen. So, as I said, they'd be happy. Maybe, they don't want everybody to disappear because they need somebody to do the dirty work. They need Untermensch. But they would like them at least to disappear from Israel.
And not like, you have to be honest about these things. And I'm not, again, trying to be rhetorical. I'm trying to be objective. Israel's a nation of murderers. Every single Israeli has been at a checkpoint, has raided a Palestinian home at night, has tortured a Palestinian child, has killed a Palestinian. It's a country of murderers. That Israel systematically, methodically, calmly, its soldiers murder kids, murder children.
So we have the first fact. Israel is not just committing war crimes, it's committing crimes against humanity, which are among the most odious crimes, the most awful crimes under international law. And Human Rights Watch says it's committing them. And if it's an illegal annexation, the Israelis have no rights whatsoever in East Jerusalem. They have no rights whatsoever in Gaza. They have no right, and let me emphasize it, they have no right of self-defense. They only have one right. They have the right to leave, to pack up their bags and leave. If your fellow citizens, so to speak, are coming under assault by these land robbers and land thieves, you have every right to join in to resist it. So, are you going to tell me that when they see happening to their fellow Palestinians in East Jerusalem, what happened to them, that they have no right to show solidarity, that they have no right to resist alongside these refugees to be? No. Building this wall with one goal, to keep their Jewish majority. They want that Jewish majority and they want all the land. But they don't want the people. They just want their Jewish majority and the land. That's the story of Israel. This state has gone too far. It's gone too far. It's become a crackpot state, a lunatic state. That is the population of Israel. Like it or not. Don't tell me they are a handful of fanatics. Don't tell me they're a handful of crazies. No. You saw it on YouTube. You saw it live. That is Israel. That is the real Israel. Pyromaniacs, land thieves, land robbers, and Jewish supremacists.
By what right? By what right alien body, alien to the Labor Party, alien to the Labor Party, foreign to the Labor Party. By what right do these mostly unelected Jewish hoodlums, by what right do they have to dictate the internal policy of a democratically controlled party?
That is to say, Benjamin Netanyahu is an obnoxious, racist, Jewish supremacist. And in all of those descriptives, obnoxious, racist, Jewish supremacist, he's wholly representative of the Israeli population. Contempt for Arabs, contempt for Muslims. Actually, with all due respect to you, Mr. Dorr, and all your listeners, unless they're Jewish, he has contempt for all of you. He's a Jewish supremacist.
It's the best thing that will ever happen to Israel if they get rid of these American Jews, who are warmongers from Martha's Vineyard. And they're warmongers from the Hamptons. And they're warmongers from Beverly Hills. And they're warmongers from Miami. It's been a disaster for Israel. You know, it's the best thing if they can ever get rid of this American Jewry. It's a curse. It's a very hard case to claim that we're having a rise of anti-Semitism. It's quite the contrary. So what you do find is, if you look at the opinion polls, there is a spike in anti-Semitism. There's a spike in increase every time Israel launches one of its murderous invasions. So in 2002, during Operation Defensive Shield, yes, you saw an increase in anti-Semitic acts in Europe, less so in the US. Then 2008-9 during Operation Cast Lead, and then this past summer. That's not anti-Semitism in any meaningful sense. That's a state that calls itself Jewish, carrying on a horrifying way. And so people react to it against Jews. If you want to prevent the anti-Semitism, there's two things you can do. Number one, you could stop committing massacres, or number two, stop calling yourself a Jewish state.
On the other hand, B'Tselem described Israel as based on the principle of Jewish supremacy. Human Rights Watch described Israel as based on the principle of Jewish domination. Those terms, I do think, have a concrete resonance for your generation, for any generation. The idea of a regime based on Jewish supremacy or Jewish domination, it obviously leaves a sour taste in your mouth, or worse, because it's being accused, not just in the occupied territories over there, but in Israel proper, what's sometimes called pre-June 1967 Israel. It's being accused of creating a regime based on Jewish supremacy or Jewish domination. And so as we in the United States are supposed to be fighting white supremacy and white domination, it means something to most Americans when they hear that Israel is a Jewish supremacist regime practicing Jewish domination. So I prefer to use the terminology of supremacy and domination rather than Zionism and apartheid. And for the period where the Israeli propaganda machine functioned very effectively, convincingly, they never feared public debate and discussion because they were confident that they would win, that the general wisdom of the times was Israel was a David fending off the Goliath in the Arab world by virtue of their ingenuity, brilliance, and good godly fortune. They managed to survive, and they're engaged still in a war of survival, what they like to call an existential threat to their survival as a state and as a people. That worked very effectively. The point being, Israel, with all of its power, with all of its sophistication, with all of its organization, it couldn't block out anymore the truth. Slowly but surely, the truth started to seep in. And the truth, to be told, the truth is very ugly. It's very ugly. And it's not a new ugliness. If you look at the Human Rights Watch report, they trace the ugliness right back to the beginning, 1947. The state was created on the basis of expelling the indigenous population, confiscating all land that didn't belong to Jews. And the process didn't just end in 1947. It's like this juggernaut. They keep pushing and pushing and pushing. And as we speak now, we see it in Jerusalem, still stealing people's homes, still relentlessly confiscating the land, forcibly removing them. It's an interminable, relentless process. It's very hard to cover that up. They were very successful for a very long time. And now I return to your question. When it became impossible to win the battle for public opinion through the normal give and take of public discourse, they start to operate behind the scenes. They start to resort to strong arm tactics. They start to resort to threats. If you don't stop this criticism, the donors said, we're going to stop giving you money. There's not going to be any more alumni contributions. Universities are wholly dependent on those alumni contributions, their endowments. They're wholly dependent on that money. Jews happen to be very rich. In the United States, I don't know the case in Canada, in the United States, they are the wealthiest ethno-religious group. They also tend to be on the liberal end of the spectrum, and they also tend to give to public facilities, museums, libraries, hospitals, and universities. And then the threats start coming in. If you don't get rid of that guy, we're not giving you money. Many people blame Alan Dershowitz, Professor Alan Dershowitz, for my fate at the pool. I actually don't think that's correct. I think it was donors and real estate owners who sat on the board of trustees of DePaul University. DePaul University is a very big real estate owner in Chicago. I think it was the pressure from them. And it's the same thing as the situation now with the professor who was denied her place. My point being, they are very, very rapidly losing the battle for public opinion. Actually, they've lost it. And that's why they resort to the tactics that you described, the donors, the strong arm tactics, because they can't stifle that freedom of speech anymore. They're losing. So now the pressure, the tightening of the screws from behind the scenes will increase because they can't win that battle for public opinion anymore. Who's going to support them now? You're kicking out families who've lived in these homes for generations in Jerusalem. Because you claim, well, before 1948, Jews owned that territory. Okay. You want to go back to pre-1948? Is that what you want to do? Fine. Pre-1948, you own 6% of Palestine. That's how much territory you own, 6%. So how about giving back to the refugees the 94% that you stole? If we're going back to before 1948, then let's give it back. All of it. Not just at home in East Jerusalem. You say Jews owned it. So you want to take it back. Okay, fine, take it back. But then you have to give back that 94% of the land that you stole from that Palestinian population. You want to do that? You want to do that? You want to go back? Let's go back. I mean, what they're doing is insane. It's a completely lunatic country. It's off the spectrum. It's lost all legitimacy. Israelis, the insatiable greed, the arrogance, the Jewish supremacy, as Betzelem called it. And now it's an irony. It's an irony. It's a paradox. The international community was willing to basically accept Israel as a Jewish state with all of its significant flaws Just give the Palestinians something. Give them something. But the Jewish supremacists, they didn't want to give them anything, nothing. They're just slaves. They're here to serve us, and better if they're gone. And now the consensus is changing. They're saying, this whole this Jewish majority, this Jewish supremacy, this Jewish domination, not just in the occupied Palestinian territories, but Israel itself, it's unacceptable. And so now the whole enterprise is being called into question. Yes, it's true, Canada. They are responsible for what has happened because they let Israel do whatever it wanted. No restrictions, no limits. Everything goes. You can, as the Human Rights Watch, not the Human Rights Watch, the Human Rights Commission of the United Nations pointed out, during the Great March of Return by Gazans trying to break out of their prison non-violently, it said the Israeli snipers were targeting children, targeting medics, targeting journalists, and targeting disabled people, people in wheelchairs, targeting them. You think your government criticized it? You think your former Attorney General Erwin Kotler criticized it? This was just murder in broad daylight, targeting children, medics, journalists, and disabled people. That's why it's come to be what it is. Had restrictions been put on Israel, had limits been placed on it, actually, I think what would have happened is there would have been a two-state settlement, and Israel probably would have had legitimacy for its policies of preserving a Jewish majority by expelling the indigenous population and reserving 93% of its land just for Jews. That never came up before. Now it's on the table. It's on the table because people have soured on this whole idea of a Jewish state because its practical incarnation, namely the state of Israel, it's a lunatic state. Can't get around it anymore. Can't get around it. And I think it kind of sensitized human rights organizations. Well, you're really trying to fight white supremacy and white domination. Well, here we have a state that says we're going to do what it takes to preserve a Jewish majority, and we're going to make sure that 93% of the land only goes to Jews.